Fast-moving show today, so now falls me to introduce our next speaker, Juliet from the Telegraph, where she's an economics writer. And she's written extensively and is going to speak to you about what I think is perhaps the most pressing topic in micro and macroeconomics in Britain today, particularly for people of your age, and that is the totally messed up state of the British housing market. And so that's what she's going to tell you about. She's going to explain, I hope, why it's in such a mess and how we can explain this and what we might do about it. So, Juliet, over to you.
Hi. So as Steve said, I'm going to talk about why housing's so expensive, and then briefly at the end, maybe what we might do about it, or given how we got here, what are the solutions? So to start with, you know what that is. It's a supply-demand graph, right? We all know how this works. As the price of stuff rises, people can't afford to buy it, so demand goes down. Conversely, as prices rise, people can afford to produce more stuff, and the supply goes up. And then we have the equilibrium, right, where they cross. So we all experience this chart in our lives daily if we go and buy chocolate bars, drinks, concert tickets, cars, etc. But for most of us, the biggest, most expensive thing we will ever buy, the most intense way in which we will experience this graph, is buying a house. The thing we will dream about buying, the thing that we will dream about our future, having a family, and that will affect our life the most. So, our ability to buy a house is the biggest determinant as to whether we will feel well off, comfortable, or as if we can fulfill our aspirations in society. So in other words, house prices are a huge component of how well a country's economy is serving its people and how good it's making them feel. And in fact, the Deputy Prime Minister, even yesterday, said that he thought that housing was a major component of why the Tories did not do so well at the last election, because young people simply came out finally to vote, and they voted against the status quo because of the housing market. So, if house prices are so important, let's take a look at the price of houses over a long period. And that is that chart, which takes you the last 50 years, 60 years, shows you what has happened to British house prices. There are a lot of ways to express what's going on here aside from this chart. So, and in fact, if you take it up to 2017, the average British house now costs about £230,000. So that's more than 10 times the average income in this country. So the average person who doesn't have parental help, it will take them about 37 years, if they're saving 5% of their income, which is actually more than people are saving at the moment, saving about 37 years to save up a deposit for the average house. And as you can see, it didn't used to be this way. Only a generation ago, houses cost £5,000 on average in this country. And admittedly, wages were lower, so that was about 3 times the average wage at that time. But what this tells us is that we are in an exceptional time. It doesn't have to be this way. It wasn't this way. This is a new thing that we are experiencing, and particularly your generation, our generation is experiencing. So, obviously, from the initial graph, the supply-demand curve, if prices have gone up that much, you would expect supply to be shooting up as well, right? You'd expect house builders to be responding, people, to be gagging to get in on the house price boom and build new houses and sell them off at a premium. But in fact, this is what's happened to supply. So as you can see, we're building fewer houses now than we were in 1970, when the price was 1/40th of what it is now. So what the hell is going on? So if we break this curve down more and we look at the composition of house building, you can see a lot of stuff. So this goes back about nearly 100 years, and it tells you who was building houses when in Britain. So, and you can see that, back in the day, the biggest component of house building was the private sector, was normal developers building houses. So the question is, if all of our housing used to be built by this green section, private house builders, why did they stop? What happened? Well, that happened with the election of this guy, Clement Attlee, and the Labour government after the war. So you had a state where housing had been massively destroyed in Britain. There was a huge shortage of houses because of the war, because of bombing, and people came back and they had nowhere to live. But you also had an ideological element to this. You had the first proper long-term Labour government elected in this country, and they had an ideology that they thought the private sector shouldn't be in charge of house building, that it was disorderly, and that what you really wanted was for the government to start building houses. And the first thing that they did was to stop private builders just building whatever they wanted. So they passed something called the Planning Act in 1947, which meant that no one could put up a house without permission. You used to be able to just, if you bought some land, you could just put up a house. For the first time in 1947, you had to get permission to start building houses. And part of the aim of that was to stop the proliferation of this thing, which is called a ribbon development, where you started, particularly with the advent of the car, people started driving more. A lot of the railways got shut down after the war. People started building houses along roads. So they started worrying about urban sprawl, miles and miles of houses strung out along commuter belts. So the specific solution to this was not just the Planning Act, but also the Green Belt. So after the war, you also had the creation of the Green Belt, which meant that huge tracts of land around cities, often in places where people most wanted to live and most wanted to build, were permanently designated as preserved zones. This didn't actually mean they had to be green. It just meant that you couldn't build houses on them. So in fact, a lot of them were turned into car parks, golf courses, or just private fields where no one could really enjoy them. Some of them also became parks and open spaces that people could enjoy. But this was the start of a whole sort of net put around our cities that was not allowed to be built on. And so what you had instead of private building, remember there was a huge housing shortage, was the government went into house building in a big way. But they needed to do it quickly, and they needed to do it cheaply. So what you got was a lot of this. And the ideology was that people should live in cheap, affordable houses, and the government should build them. So what you had basically, what you have is these two pieces of regulation put together. The Planning Act and the Green Belt basically killed off about half of private house building, as you can see. Well, in fact, it initially killed off a lot more, and it sort of fluctuated after that, but it never quite got back up to the level that it was before. And this went on for a few decades, as you can see, with tower blocks being put up everywhere and people being housed in a different way than they ever had before. So the question is, we saw a huge growth in this red part of the chart, and then that dies off. So the question is, why did that die off? Why did half the housing market, the house-producing market, disappear? And the answer is this lady. So, as most of you probably know, Thatcher was responding to an age after the war in which people thought the state should do everything. The war economy involved the state looking after everyone, the state organizing everything, and then that precipitated a huge economic crisis. Thatcher thought the state should be doing a lot less, including a lot less house building. So she reduced local councils' ability to build, introduced the right to buy, which privatized a lot of the housing stock. So, but what that did, in combination with the Planning Act and the Green Belt, which were never repealed, meant that Britain's two main sources of houses were cut off. So you had, well, there was still a lot of private building, but it was severely restricted and much more expensive than it had been before, and government building was also cut off. So what you got to was the current situation. And as you can see, planning regulations got worse and worse, so that poor Jacob here even needed planning permission for his Wendy house, and even that was denied. The Green Belt expanded, and the government just indulged more and more homeowner NIMBYism, people saying, we don't want developments here, and if they are going to be here, they're going to have to look like this, and the developer's going to have to build this and this in addition to the houses, piling more and more costs onto developers, making it harder and harder, and gunging up the whole process of house building. At the same time as that was happening, this is sort of the 90s or later 90s, immigration started to increase and the population started to grow to the point where it's now growing at a point higher than it has been since about the 1960s. So the question is, who won and who lost from this situation? Because there have to be a lot of winners, otherwise the situation wouldn't have continued. And this tells you what happened to home ownership over a lot of that period. And for most of that slope is a pretty positive chart. It tells you that by the 90s, most people in Britain, the vast majority of households, were living in homes that they owned. So homeowners massively gained from the situation because if house prices go up, the value of their property shot up. So you had a growing constituency of people who wanted to see house prices rise. And for governments, it made a lot of sense to preside over a situation where house prices just continued to go up. In fact, you had about 18 million people, million households living in homes that they owned, and only about 4 million people living in houses that were rented. So you can see from a politician's point of view, where are there more votes? There's clearly more votes in pandering to homeowners and letting them decide what happens, giving them more and more rights to veto development. The other big beneficiaries of this situation are landowners. This tells you the value of land with planning permission and the value of land without planning permission. And what it shows you is that anyone who owns land or any developer who can get a contract with someone who does own land stands to gain this unbelievable premium. And so the premium for building has just gone up and up and up. And the question is, who loses out from this situation? And the answer broadly is you guys, young people. So this shows you who's starting to own homes more and who's starting to own homes less. And you can see that the older you are, the more positive the picture gets. So you're more and more likely to become a homeowner, which makes sense, because as you go through life, you get wealthier, you earn more, you have a greater ability to buy a house. So that should be a natural progression. But what has happened on the other side is an incredibly extreme deterioration in the situation. So about 30 or 40 years ago, maybe a fifth of you would by now be either owning or on your way to owning a house. Now, I don't know what the proportion is now, but I would bet it is much, much lower than that. So, and this suited governments because the truth was that most of you didn't vote. And so it was kind of politically cost-free to allow house prices to rise. But as you can see, those are the old people enjoying their home. As you can see, this curve is now going down. Home ownership is now falling. We have reached such an extreme situation in this country that despite unbelievably loose credit, cheaper cost of borrowing than we've ever had before, people still cannot afford to buy. And what is happening is that home ownership is going down, and that line's starting to go down, and the yellow line, which is renters, is starting to go up. And this tells you something about how politics might change, and maybe is changing, and tells you perhaps something about what happened at the most recent election. So there's a question as to, maybe this will change the political calculation, but the question is, how are we going to respond to it? How are we going to respond to this situation? And there are broadly two options, right? We can go ahead, we can go back to one of the two situations. We can say that the government ought to start building houses, and this is a more modern development than the kind of grim tower block we saw before, but it's generally sort of blocks and it's done cheaply. Or we can say we have to free up the situation so that private builders can start building again, and this is more of a sort of private development type thing on the other side. Or we could say we want some kind of hybrid situation because the political economy of planning laws is such a nightmare, frankly, that maybe the government should just build the stuff and then what they could do is sell them off once they've built them. And actually, one of the things in the Tory manifesto, which was dropped in the latest Queen's speech, was that the government would do just that. But unfortunately, that has been killed off, at least for now. But either way, the point is, we can't call ourselves a wealthy, healthy society unless most people at some point in their lives feel that they have a realistic chance of owning a home. This is the basic of a good life, and at the center of that all is house prices.